He entered the shelter with slow, steady steps, as if he were carrying on his legs the weight of a lifetime of memories that no one sees. Thomas Walker, 72, a veteran of the United States Marine Corps, had an expression on his face marked by time. And by something even deeper. The silence of someone who has lost everything that mattered. He was wearing his old Marine cap, the same one he had worn when he returned from the war, and although no one else commented on it, he always wore it when he walked through the streets of rural Kansas. "I'm just looking," he said quietly to the attendant, unsmiling. It was a lie, and he knew it. You don't go into an animal shelter just to look. But he wasn't ready to admit how he felt. The hallways were full of barking, butts wagging, paws scraping against bars. But it was the silence that caught his attention. In the darkest corner of the rejects ward stood an older black Labrador retriever with scarred ears and an eye that seemed to have forgotten its light. Beside the fence, a clipboard with red letters shouted a warning. "Anxious! Not recommended for adoption." Tom crouched down slowly. No one had ever seen him do that. And without thinking much, he whispered a word that had not crossed his lips for years. Rest. The effect was immediate. The dog, who had not responded to any stimulus, stood up, straightened his body, sat down, and looked straight into Tom's eyes as if he had just heard the dawn bell. The attendant stopped what she was doing. Her eyes widened. "This has never happened. He's never done this before." But Tom didn't answer. He didn't ask. He didn't hesitate. He simply pointed to the adoption form and said, "Let's take it home." Have you ever felt like something inexplicable just happened before your eyes? That a simple, almost banal gesture opened the door to something bigger, something you don't yet understand, but that touches your heart. That's exactly what Tom felt. He didn't know the dog's name. He didn't know where it came from. He had no idea what was behind those sunken eyes. But something inside him, the part that still remembered the screams on the radio, the helicopters overhead, and the desert dust, knew there was a code there. A bond. In the following days, the two lived together in silence. No parties, no licking, no jumping. Just the company of two beings marked by time and war, living under the same roof. But then the signs began. Small, discreet. The dog obeyed commands that Tom didn't remember saying out loud. He waited for the order to cross the threshold. He slept near the window, always facing the street, as if he were guarding it. And at 6 o'clock in the morning sharp, he sat motionless in front of the rising sun. It was as if he had returned to service, as if he was still on a mission. Tom began to wonder, who was that animal? What kind of past did it carry in its paws? And why, deep down, did he seem to recognize a companion in him, even without knowing his name? What you're about to discover may surprise you, because this story goes far beyond an adopted dog. It speaks of loyalty, of invisible scars, and of a connection that only those who have served can explain. But all of this only started to make sense the day that, by chance, Tom turned on the television, and the national anthem started to play. And what happened next? You need to see it with your own eyes. The silence in the house was thick. Not the kind of silence that was welcoming, but one that carried weight, memory, and absence. The old couch creaked as Tom shifted in the night, trying to find a position that would support his spine. It had been decades since he had slept properly, and now, even with the company of a dog, everything felt the same. And yet strange. The animal didn't climb on the furniture, didn't explore the rooms like other animals would. He kept alert, always lying between the front door and the wall, like a sentry at an outpost. Tom watched this with the same uneasiness as someone watching an old movie, the kind you know how it ends but can't stop watching. There was an invisible ritual going on there, something that escaped words and could only be felt. For the first week, Tom tried to offer him toys, treats, even a blanket, but the dog refused everything. He would stand still in front of the objects, as if they were not part of his world. The only time his body reacted with anything resembling emotion was when he heard the balcony door open, even if no one came out. He would stare at it for endless seconds, as if he were waiting for someone. Tom began to relive old memories. The way his friend Connor had looked exactly the same during the nights at the desert outposts. His hands shaking as they cleaned his weapons, his eyes fixed on the horizon, even in the darkness. That dog wasn't just a dog. He was a living shadow of everything Tom had tried to forget. The following days brought more repetitions. At 6 o'clock every morning, the dog would sit in the same spot, facing the east window, and remain upright for almost exactly 7 minutes. Then he would return to his corner, as if he were following a routine that no one else remembered, not even him. But his body remembered. Because real pain doesn't go away with time. It adapts and takes new forms. One day, Tom had to go out to get some groceries. He left an old camera running in the living room. He was just curious. He wanted to see what the dog did by himself. When he came back, he started the video. And what he saw made his chest tighten. The animal walked to the bookshelf, where there was a wooden box with a small flag folded in a triangle. The same one Tom had received at Connor's funeral. Bravo, as he started to call the dog, approached the box. He sniffed it. He sat down. And he stayed there, for minutes, without moving. Tom couldn't hold back his tears. That gesture seemed like a silent vigil, as if the dog felt there was something sacred there, as if he were saluting with his heart. But the turning point came on an ordinary morning, one of those mornings when coffee is made out of habit and the news just fills the air. Tom turned on the television without thinking, as he did every Sunday. And that day, the national anthem began to play. It was not a ceremony, nor a special date, just part of the programming of a local channel. The sound filled the room, and without warning, Bravo stood up. He didn't run. He didn't bark. He just walked to the front of the TV. He planted his paws on the floor and sat up straight, like a soldier in the yard of a military base. And he began to howl. It was no ordinary howl. There was no despair, no fear. It was a long, deep sound, like a song of honor, a lament of longing and reverence. A tribute. Tom stopped everything. The spoon fell from his hand. He stood in the middle of the room, his heart pounding and his mind going back 20 years. This was exactly what the dogs did at flag ceremonies. He had seen it. He had lived it. And now, years later, in that forgotten corner of Kansas, an anonymous dog was doing the same thing, in front of a television. Tom ran his fingers over his face. He felt ashamed that he hadn't noticed before. How could someone be so oblivious to the truth that was right in front of their eyes? Over the next few hours, she sifted through papers, looked for documents at the shelter, called old contacts. The answers didn't come quickly, but they began to form a puzzle. A name, a number, a history of failed adoptions. An incident in 2010 in Afghanistan. A K-9 team that went missing after an ambush. And then, it all made sense. Bravo wasn't just a rejected dog. He was a veteran, a survivor. A soldier without a uniform, but with a fighter's soul. Someone who lost his partner in combat, and never stopped waiting for him to return. It was like looking in a mirror. And in that moment, Tom felt something he hadn't felt since Connor's funeral. Belonging. Bravo had been through homes, rejections, loneliness. And yet, he maintained his ritual, his posture, his mission. Tom took the old medal he kept in the back of the drawer, the only one he had never shown to anyone. He placed it on the floor, between him and the dog. Bravo sniffed it. He lay down next to it. And there they stayed, for hours, like two soldiers who had finally recognized each other. Maybe the outside world would never understand. Maybe no one would ever appreciate that connection. But between them, there was no need to say anything anymore. But there was more. Something yet to be revealed. A detail forgotten in the records. A hidden truth about to emerge. One that would change everything Tom thought he knew about this animal, about the war itself, and about himself. Write in the comments, "This touched my soul." And stay with me, because the story is just beginning. The wind blew against the windows on that gray Tuesday morning. The sunlight barely penetrated the heavy curtains of the house, but still, at 6 o'clock sharp, Bravo stood up. He walked to the east window with the same precision as always. He sat down, his chest held high and his gaze fixed on the horizon. He didn't even blink. Tom watched from a distance, a cup of coffee half cold in his shaking hands. There was something about the ritual that disturbed him deeply. And it wasn't just the act itself. It was what it triggered inside him. The muscle memory of a life he was struggling to forget. The rigid punctuality, the control, the weight of responsibility. He knew it. He knew it all too well. But Tom was no longer a soldier. At least, that was what he told himself every day. He avoided watches. He avoided ceremonies. He avoided anything that reminded him of war. But that dog, it was like a mirror of what he had once been. A reflection of the discipline he had abandoned out of pain, not choice. That day, something inside Tom rebelled. He approached the dog before the ritual began. He tried to distract him with a piece of meat, with a whistle, with a light touch on his back. But Bravo didn't move. When his time was up, he turned, walked over to Tom, stopped in front of him, and bowed his head. Not out of submission, but out of respect. Tom swallowed, and for the first time in years, he found himself muttering, "I'm sorry." He didn't know if he was talking to the dog, or to someone who was no longer there. Then he began to notice other patterns. Bravo wouldn't eat until Tom was seated. He wouldn't walk through open doors without a signal. He wouldn't enter any dark rooms, unless Tom was inside. It was as if he were waiting for orders. As if he were still on the battlefield. One night, while putting a box in the attic, Tom found an old uniform folded up. The feel of the fabric made him shiver. He sat down on the floor, sweating coldly, his heart pounding. He couldn't wear it anymore. It was like wearing a body that no longer fit him, a past that ached at every seam. Bravo slowly walked up the stairs, stopped at the entrance, and stood still, in position. He didn't dare go in. He just waited. Tom slowly spread his uniform on the floor, and for the first time, he saw the dog lie down on it. Softly, as if he recognized the scent, as if he was coming home. Time passed slowly that week. Tom barely slept. His nights were filled with memories of sand, sirens, voices on the radio, explosions in the distance. And in the midst of it all, Bravo remained motionless, like a silent sentinel, always to his left, as if he understood, as if he shared that burden. On Saturday, Tom decided to try something. He pulled out an old recording of a flag-raising ceremony at Camp Bastion. He turned on the stereo, slowly turned up the volume, and watched. Bravo heard the first chord and froze. He walked slowly to the center of the room. He assumed his position. Body firm, stare fixed, no unnecessary movements. When the hymn reached its climax, he began to howl. A low, restrained, long howl, not of pain, but of reverence. It was impossible to deny that animal was executing a learned gesture, not by instinct, but by memory. Tom fell to his knees. She cried like she hadn't cried since the funeral, because at that moment, it wasn't just the dog that was in the posture. It was their entire past. The impact of that scene left Tom stunned for hours. Like a whirlwind of old emotions coming back to the surface. And from that moment on, a need began to grow inside him. To understand the truth. It was no longer enough to just feel. He needed to know. He went to the garage, opened an old file box, and started making calls. He found the number for the shelter. He asked for access to the animal's records. Then he called a retired sergeant he knew from active duty. No one knew for sure, but one piece of information led to another. Within 2 days, Tom had a timeline. Bravo had been found in 2011, on the outskirts of a decommissioned base in Afghanistan. Injured, disoriented. His handler had disappeared after an IED attack. The dog had been transported to the U.S., passed through 3 foster homes, and then was deemed unstable for regular adoption. But what no one realized was that he never failed to follow orders. That hurt, because Bravo, like many soldiers, didn't come back broken. He came back loyal. But no one knew what to make of it, and at that point, something curious happened. The sense of isolation that Tom had carried for years began to change. For the first time, he felt that he was no longer alone in the minefield of memory. Someone, even a four-legged one, understood his wordless language. But one question remained. Why did that dog react so much to the hymn? Why were the rituals so precise? Who trained him like that? It was while searching for answers to this that Tom came across a name in a forgotten report. And that name ignited something he thought he had buried forever. Write in the comments. This connection gave me goosebumps. Because what Tom is about to discover will change everything and reveal the real reason Bravo is back. The smell of coffee was still in the air when the sound of the national anthem began to fill the room from the television. It was one of those Sundays when nothing seemed to happen. The kind of morning when the world turned slowly. But in that moment, something stopped. Something invisible, but huge. Bravo stood up. With a precise movement, he walked to the front of the screen. He stood with his back straight, his head held high, as if he were standing before a waving flag, not some digital image. Tom stood still. Steam rose slowly from the mug until his fingers gave out, and it fell, shattering on the floor. The sound Bravo made wasn't a bark. It was a long, restrained howl, filled with something Tom knew well, honor and loss at the same time. It was not a lament for the present, but a reverence for the past. The same sound he had heard at Camp Bastion, when patrol dogs saluted beside their handlers who had died in action. Tom felt his body go cold. His hands covered his face, but his eyes couldn't look away from the scene. The posture, the silence, the steady breathing, the absolute presence. It was as if Bravo was back at base, as if that small gesture in that forgotten room in Kansas was a sacred ritual that no one remembered anymore. And that's when Tom realized that animal wasn't remembering. He had never forgotten. In the days that followed, Tom dug deep. He called old acquaintances. He rummaged through cardboard boxes he hadn't touched in more than a decade. He went back to writing down times, details, names. There was a restlessness inside him, something pulsing. It wasn't just curiosity, it was debt. He needed to know where Bravo came from, who he had been. The response came on a yellowed sheet of paper from a retired sergeant. The report was incomplete. Officially, the dog had been classified as an unidentified field survivor and repatriated without formal history. But one hand-scrawled sentence stood out. K9 tag MIA 2103. Handler missing. Status unknown. Tom knew that number. It was from the same division Connor had served in. The same platoon that had been ambushed in 2010. The same day the radio had gone silent and the helicopters had been slow to arrive. Memories came flooding back. The scream of the explosive. The dust blinding the eyes. The smell of metal and blood. And Connor, gone. Only his helmet had been found. And now, before him, a dog with scars on his eyes. And command still alive in his soul. Tom went down to the basement that night. He carried an old box into the living room. Inside were scraps of uniforms, faded photos, medals he had never displayed. He sat down on the floor. Bravo approached slowly. When he saw Connor's picture, he stopped. He nuzzled it. Then he lay down beside it. Silently. Time froze for a few seconds. Tom couldn't take it anymore. He broke down. That image of the dog standing guard next to the face of a man who had never had a grave was more than he could bear. His mind was spinning. His breath was short. And suddenly, he understood. Bravo was there that day. He saw everything. He survived the ambush. And the worst part, maybe he was waiting for orders that never came. But there was one more detail. Something Tom didn't know yet. A small error in the records. A line left out. An incomplete name. It was on a connection to a military base in Topeka that everything changed. The young dispatcher hesitated, but upon hearing the number K9MIA Twin Ones Row 3, his tone changed. He asked Tom to hold. Minutes later, an older voice took over the line. It was Lieutenant Sam Fisher, now retired. "Did you say Bravo?" "Yes, sir." There was silence, then a sigh. That dog. He saved 3 soldiers that day, but no one found him afterwards. He was considered lost. There was even a symbolic ceremony for him. Tom's eyes widened. "He is with me." Do you have any idea what that means? But before Tom could answer, the lieutenant added, "Can you bring it here? There are a lot of people who need to see this with their own eyes." At the end of the line, Tom heard voices in the background, and suddenly he felt that something bigger was about to happen. That journey, which began in a forgotten shelter, now pointed to a reunion with the truth, with honor, with everything that had been lost between explosions and silence. Bravo wasn't just a dog nobody wanted. He was a living symbol of an unfinished mission. Write in the comments, "That got me really bad, because reuniting with the base is closer than you think." The asphalt vibrated beneath the tires of the old truck as Tom drove down the highway toward Topeka. The golden fields of Kansas stretched silently on either side, but he could barely make out the landscape. The world around him seemed blurred. The only thing clear in his mind was what he had just discovered, and what it meant. Bravo lay in the passenger seat, his head up, watching every turn as if he knew exactly where they were going. He didn't move much, just kept his eyes straight ahead. And for a moment, Tom almost thought he remembered that route. Or maybe it was just instinct. But something about his posture made him seem less like an animal, and more like a soldier on his way to duty. At the base entrance, the uniformed guards eyed the truck suspiciously. Tom got out slowly, unhurriedly, and handed over the documents. The dog remained on the bench, motionless. The younger soldier looked inside, then at the paper, then back at Bravo. "Is this the—" he muttered. Tom just nodded. The gate opened. Inside the base, the atmosphere was different. The buildings were new, but the smell of asphalt, the sound of helicopters in the distance, everything brought back memories like silent stabs. Every step Tom took through the yard was accompanied by memories that time could not erase. But the worst part was not remembering. It was knowing that he had walked alone for so many years, thinking that no one else carried that burden. Lieutenant Fisher was waiting for him outside the main hangar. He was older, slower, but still had that steady look of someone who has seen too much to be surprised by anything. When he saw Bravo step out of the car, something broke in his expression. His eyes narrowed. His breath caught. And he whispered, "My God, it's him." There was no ceremony, no formal greeting. Just a dense and respectful silence. Several soldiers approached little by little. Some veterans, others still in service. One of them, upon seeing Bravo, fell to his knees. Another covered his face with his hands. There was something in that presence that needed no explanation. Tom watched with a knot in his chest. The dog who had been forgotten, rejected, considered unstable, was now revered by men who understood what he had endured. Bravo walked to the center of the yard, and without being asked, sat up straight, as he always did. The silence turned to reverence. That's when Fisher asked something unexpected, that Tom accompany Bravo to the old K9 training room. Although it was no longer in use, it had been preserved as a memorial. As he entered, the air seemed to change. It was like breathing in compressed memory. The concrete floor, the empty cages, the black and white photos. Everything there told stories that had never been written. And then, without warning, Bravo stopped in front of a wall. He stared at a particular photograph. An old, framed, faded image. 2 soldiers kneeling beside a dog, their eyes intent, the posture of someone who had just completed a mission. Tom approached slowly. His heart raced. One of the men in the photo was Connor. Tom's legs gave out. He leaned against the wall to keep from falling. That photo wasn't there by chance. It was a fragment of the past that had been buried by poorly filled out reports and forced silences. Bravo remembered. He recognized it. Fisher put a hand on Tom's shoulder. "This is from 2010, Forward Base Echo. This dog saved 3 men that night. His handler disappeared right after the ambush. We never found him. But now we know. Bravo stayed. He stayed until the end." Tom closed his eyes. This was more than a revelation. It was justice. It was like sewing up an invisible hole in his chest. In the days that followed, Bravo underwent examinations, formal recognition, and for the first time was registered as an honored veteran, not as a shelter animal, but as a combatant. And most surprisingly, Tom was invited to a ceremony, not just to watch, but to be alongside Bravo at the symbolic reinstatement of the platoon. On the way home, at dusk, Tom drove with a lightness he hadn't felt in decades. Bravo, in the seat next to him, slept peacefully. Through the window, the golden sky seemed to announce something new. Something like, starting over. But there was one last gesture. One decision Tom had to make. Because not all the scars had healed. And there was still a name, a place, and a promise pending. Comment here. This story needs to be remembered. Because Tom's next choice will touch something even deeper. Not just in him, but in everyone who has ever struggled to find their place in the world. The sky was clear that morning, but the air still carried the winter chill that insisted on lingering. Tom adjusted the collar of his coat as he waited in the base's courtyard, his gaze fixed on the cracked concrete floor. Bravo stood by his side, steady as always. They were both still, but what was happening inside was anything but still. It was as if time had been condensed there. Memories, losses, reunions, everything converged on that moment. The ceremony was about to begin. The flag was already flying on the flagpole. The anthem echoed through the loudspeakers with a respect that silenced even the youngest recruit. The rhythmic footsteps of the soldiers broke the silence with mathematical precision. But no one seemed to hear it louder than Bravo. He stepped forward on his own. He stood in front of the mast and took up his position. He wasn't trained for this. He just remembered. His back was straight, his head held high, his eyes fixed on the flag. His body seemed to be communicating with something sacred. Tom watched with a mixture of pride and guilt. Pride at seeing this animal finally recognized as a hero. Guilt at having spent so many years denying himself any kind of ceremony, any form of honor. There, standing beside that dog who had never stopped serving, Tom understood what he had really given up. Not the war, but the idea of deserving any peace. Across the courtyard, a high-ranking officer approached. It was General Mark Rutledge, a name Tom hadn't heard since 2003. He was grayer, heavier, but his eyes still held the strength of someone who commands with presence. He said nothing. He just knelt down in front of Bravo, slowly ran his hand over his head, and whispered something that no one else could hear. Then he stood up, saluted, and returned to formation. The silence that followed said it all. And it was at that moment that Bravo broke his rigidity. He took a step toward Tom, and for the first time, he leaned against him of his own free will. Not as a soldier, but as a friend. Tom felt the gesture like a hug, the first one he had accepted in a long time. Later, in the base briefing room, as the official paperwork was being prepared, Tom stared at the medal that had been ordered for Bravo. Engraved in aged gold was the inscription, "Standing strong when no one else could." That was it. That was all. But something was still missing. Before he left, Tom asked for a moment alone at the memorial to the fallen. He walked over to the panel that listed the names of those who had not returned. There, in the 4th row, was Connor's name. Tom's hand touched the cool stone, his eyes burning, and he whispered, "He was with you until the end. I didn't know, but now I know." Bravo sat down beside him. He didn't bark, he just stood there, like he had done so many times, like he would do as many times as necessary. On the way home, the road felt different. Time moved slower, but not out of regret, in reverence. Tom drove with the window cracked, letting the wind in. Bravo slept with his head back against the seat. For the first time, there was peace here. Arriving in the village, Tom stopped his car before entering his property. He got out, walked to the front fence, and removed an old, weathered sign. It was just a piece of wood that said, "Private." He broke it and threw it away. Then he took a new piece, which he had brought from the base. He wrote with his own hand, "2 veterans live here, both still on deployment." He hung firmly, like someone putting down a new root. Over the next few days, something strange began to happen. Children began knocking on his door with innocent questions about Bravo. Young scouts asked to hear his stories. Families left little notes of gratitude in his mailbox. And before he knew it, Tom had become something he never sought, a symbol of reconnection. People who had never looked at him on the street now called him Mr. Walker. And Bravo, the rejected dog, became a local legend. But in the midst of all this, there was a letter. An aged brown envelope that Tom had yet to open. He had found it days ago, tucked among the old documents Lieutenant Fisher had given him. In the sender, only one name, Rachel Donovan. And next to it, a single word, confidential. Tom held the envelope between his fingers, his heart pounding. He felt that there was something big inside, something that could change everything again. Write in the comments, "Not all silence is oblivion," because what that letter said was something no one could have imagined. The dust rose slowly as Tom's boots hit the dirt road for the 1,000th time. It was late afternoon. Golden light filtered through the branches of the dry trees, tinging everything with a soft melancholy. Beside him, Bravo walked with shorter steps than before, but with the same firmness as always. There was no hurry. Neither of them was afraid of the weather anymore. Since they returned from the base, their routine had changed, but in a silent way. The world outside still spun as before, but inside that farm, something had aligned. Something that didn't depend on clocks, promises, or public recognition. It was deeper. It was like a pact between 2 survivors who had finally found each other. Tom stopped by the fence, holding his coffee in his left hand and a crumpled envelope in the other. He hadn't opened it yet. Ever since that day at the base, he'd left it on his dresser, running his fingers over it without the courage to tear it. But now it was different. Bravo sat on the ground, breathing calmly, but looking alert, as if he knew this was no ordinary moment. Tom opened it slowly, pulling out a handwritten sheet of paper in old, firm handwriting. The paper smelled of memory. The first paragraph made him shiver. "Senior Walker, my name is Rachel Donovan. I was a field nurse in Kandahar. I took care of Connor after the attack. He survived for a few hours, long enough to say something that has never left my mind." Tom leaned against the fence. The world seemed to have disappeared around him. Each line of that letter was like an emotional grenade thrown against his resistance. Connor didn't die instantly. He held on, even with his body bruised, even after the crash and the loss of blood. He fought long enough to ask for Bravo to be taken care of. He said the dog was his fighting soulmate, that if anything happened to him, someone would need to make sure Bravo wasn't treated like just another animal. But the chaos of that day led to broken promises. The evacuation was disorganized. Bravo disappeared. And Rachel, now living in seclusion in Maine, only recently learned that the dog had been found. She apologized in the letter, even though it was no fault of hers. And she wrote, with brutal sincerity, one final sentence. "If you're reading this, it's because Bravo has found the home Connor was hoping for. Thank you for being that home." Tom read it out loud, his voice cracking. His hands were shaking. A whole movie played in his head. Connor's last smile, the muffled sound of the radio, the dust, the silence, the return, the fear, the guilt. Bravo, even without understanding words, lay down at Tom's feet. That was it. The invisible conclusion of a mission that had crossed continents, years, and scars. Later, as night fell, Tom sat in the chair on the porch, the blanket on his knees, and his Bravo medal in his hand. He said nothing. He didn't need to. In the background, the distant sound of the national anthem echoed from the television, which he left on at a low volume every night. A simple, almost sacred ritual. And as always, Bravo stood up. He walked to the edge of the balcony. He sat down. He remained still. His posture was perfect. His gaze was steady. Even though he was old, even though he was tired, even though half the world had already forgotten everything that had happened, Bravo still stood up. Because when all that's left is memory, honor is what sustains the body. The next morning, Tom woke up with a discomfort in his chest. A strange sensation, as if the air had become heavier. Bravo was not at the foot of the bed, nor at the door. He found him on the porch, lying in a guard position, but his breathing was too slow. Tom knelt beside him. He touched his still warm back. He called his name. Bravo looked up, but not his body. His muscles no longer obeyed. Tom leaned his forehead against his. He stayed like that for minutes. He whispered just 3 words. Mission accomplished, warrior. That day, the entire village came to a standstill. Children lined up in front of the fence. A group of local veterans came to salute. A flag was raised in silence. Tom buried Bravo under the tree, where he always stopped to watch the sunset. He placed a simple cross with the inscription, K9, MIA 2103, never left post. If you felt this connection too, leave a comment below with the phrase, Bravo, mission accomplished, just so I know that you stayed until the end and walked with us through every step of this journey. Take the opportunity to leave a like, because that shows me that it's worth continuing to bring stories that truly touch the heart. And if this type of content speaks to you, subscribe to the channel. Here, each video is made for those who still believe that there are values that time does not erase. There is a video here on the side that complements this message. Click and continue with me there. The next story also has a lot to say.